All right, today we're going to break down a huge development in global trade, something that's been decades in the making. We're talking about the free trade agreement between India and the European Union. And let me tell you, this isn't just any deal. This could be a real game changer. I mean, you know it's a big deal when India's own commerce minister calls it the mother of all trade deals. That one quote really just captures the historic scale and the sheer ambition of what's on the table. So what exactly makes this thing so monumental? So let's dive in. First, let's just unpack that phrase. We're going to look at the sheer size and scope of this thing to really understand why everyone's calling it a landmark pact for India. Okay, to get a sense of the scale here, just look at this number. 120 billion euros. That's how much merchandise trade was flowing between India and the EU back in 2024 alone. The relationship is already massive, and this deal is basically designed to hit the accelerator. And we're talking about something that, once it's signed, is going to be one of the biggest, most wide-ranging trade pacts India has ever had. The whole idea here is that it's a win-win, covering a ton of different sectors and totally reshaping the economic ties between them. Which, brings us to the big question, right? If this deal is so important, why did it take so long to happen? And why, all of a sudden, is it moving forward with this incredible urgency? Well, the answer is kind of like a perfect storm of different factors all coming together at once. Now, this timeline, it's really interesting when you look at it. Talks first kicked off way back in 2007, but they kind of fizzled out and were totally abandoned by 2013. For almost 10 years, nothing. Then, boom, in 2022, they relaunched, and since then, the pace has just been nonstop. So, what changed? What was the spark? Well, a few key things. First, there was a lot of uncertainty about a trade deal with the US, which made both India and the EU look for other major partners. Second, India had this great momentum, successfully closing deals with the UK, Australia, and the UAE. And third, and this is a big one, both India and the EU have shared concerns about China's economic power, which makes them much more attractive partners to each other. And this right here, this really paints the picture perfectly. On one hand, you've got the US talks, totally stalled with high tariffs hurting Indian exporters. But on the other hand, the EU negotiations have been racing ahead. 20 out of 24 chapters are already closed. This created a massive opportunity to kind of soften the blow from the US tariffs and crack open a huge new market. So let's get into the nitty-gritty. What's actually in this historic agreement? Let's break down the key parts and, just as important, the major compromises that finally made it all possible. The reason this deal even works is that the two economies aren't really fighting for the same turf. They actually complement each other. India's looking for more access for its big, labor-intensive sectors, like textiles, gems, and footwear. Plus, they want more pathways for skilled Indian professionals to work in the EU. In return, the EU wants to sell more of its cars and beverages in India and, crucially, open up new ways for long-term investment into the country. Okay, and this next point? This is absolutely huge. You have to understand this. The single biggest reason this deal is happening now is because of what's not in it: agriculture. This has always been a super sensitive, major roadblock for both sides. Taking it completely off the table, well, that was the key that unlocked the entire negotiation. But just because agriculture was out didn't mean it was smooth sailing. There was still some major hurdles to clear. The negotiators really had to wrestle with three big issues. First, the EU's brand new carbon tax. Second, finding the right balance on tariffs for European cars. And third, hammering out all the details of a new chapter all about securing long-term investment. So you might be hearing this term CBAM and wondering what on earth it is. Let's break it down real quick. It's basically the world's first carbon tax. It puts a fee on imports that are really energy intensive to make, like steel and aluminum, which happen to be major exports for India. So you can see why figuring this out was a total make or break issue for the whole deal. Okay, so we've talked about what's in the deal and how it all came together. So what's the big picture here? With the deal nearly done, what does this all actually mean for India's economy and its place on the world stage? Well, the ripple effects are just massive. For starters, it's a huge boost for those export sectors that create a lot of jobs. It also gives Indian exporters a really important alternative to the unpredictable US market. It strengthens India's Look West policy, which is this strategic push to build deeper ties with developed economies. And finally, it creates this powerful economic partnership that acts as a strategic counterweight to China's influence. And another huge piece of this puzzle is investment. See, India isn't just lowering its tariffs for nothing. It's asking for serious, long-term investment commitments in return. Just look at the recent deal with the EFTA countries. That secured a promise of $100 billion in investment. The thinking is that this EU pact will follow a similar model, which could bring any massive new wave of foreign capital.
So, where do we go from here? The deal is so close you can almost taste it, but there are still a few final steps needed to get this historic agreement across the finish line. Right now, the negotiators are in the final stretch, that really tough last leg of the race. They're working to close out those last 4 chapters. And the goal, the big symbolic moment they're aiming for, is to have it all ready for a formal signing when top EU leaders visit India as chief guests for the Republic Day celebrations. It's a pretty powerful deadline for a landmark achievement.
It really feels like a generational shift, and it leaves you with this one big question to think about. Will this pact be the thing that redefines India's place in the global economy for generations to come? Thanks for joining me for this explainer.